Hello and welcome to our webinar on the impacts of Intel, a transportation discussion with guest panelists from around the region. This is our third event of our Impacts of Intel summer series. My name is Jerica Logan. I am the outreach coordinator at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA, and I will be your host for this event. If you require a closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Click on the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see the subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit any questions you have at the end at any time of the webinar in the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation, and if we do not get to your question, we do apologize. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. This event is approved for one AICP CM credit. To claim your CM credit, log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter in the event into your online CM event log. There will also be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. If you have any time, please provide your feedback. I am now going to pass it over to our director, Harvey Miller.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to our discussion about the impacts of Intel. This is our summer webinar series where we're bringing together panels of experts and action leaders, both on the Ohio State campus, but also people in the community who are addressing the various aspects of the Intel project and what it'll mean for the state of Ohio. As we saw in the news just this week that the CHIPS Act has passed Congress, so it is full steam ahead for this development, which will have big impacts on the state of Ohio. We think both positive, but also negative. And our goal, of course, is to accent the positive and to try to mitigate or adapt to any of the negative consequences. But we have a great panel here today to talk about transportation impacts of this development. And our final in this series of discussions will be August 5th, when we'll talk about the impacts of Intel on energy and water in Ohio. So check out our webpage, cura.osu.edu, to register for webinars and events. You can also follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook. That way you'll never miss any of the exciting events that are happening at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. So we have a great panel today, a really great panel of transportation experts and also people who are doing things in the trenches to try to make mobility better in Central Ohio and across the state. And I'll start off by introducing our panelists. First, we have Lexi Petrella. She is a senior mobility planner at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, or MORPC as it's known to its friends. Lexi is responsible for leading the development and follow through of the Regional Mobility Plan. This is a coordinated transportation plan for 9 counties in Central Ohio that looks to improve cross-county multimodal connectivity and program collaboration. Lexi is also responsible for the mobility management program, maximizing the use of alternative modes of transportation to decrease isolation and improve the quality of life for older adults, people with disabilities, and people with low incomes. Lexi's work also supports transportation demand management through stakeholder partnerships and outreach strategies to help ensure the success of sustainable mobility initiatives and maximize alternative transportation use in Central Ohio. Thank you, Lexi, for being here. We also have Andre Carell. Andre Carell is an assistant professor of transportation at The Ohio State University and director of the OSU Travel Behavior Research Group. His expertise is in travel demand modeling and public transit, and his research focuses on the dynamics of travel behavior, travelers' adaptation to experienced service quality, and the impact of emerging mobility technologies on travel behavior. He primarily works with data that he collects through revealed preference and stated preference surveys, mobile phone location tracking, and smartphone-based travel experience surveys. And his main methodological expertise is in discrete choice modeling. Dr. Carell is jointly appointed in the Civil Engineering Department and City Regional Planning Program at the Knowlton School, and he's a core faculty member of the OSU Translational Data Analytics Institute. Dr. Carell is recipient of a very prestigious 2021 National Science Foundation Career Award. Dr. Carell graduated from UC Berkeley, MIT, and ETH Zurich. That's a nice collection of schools there, Andre, and was a postdoctoral scholar at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Thank you, Andre, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Last but not least is Kim Sharp. Kimberly Sharp is the Senior Director of Development for the Central Ohio Transit Authority, or COTA, as we know it more familiar. And she joined COTA in 2019. She is an experienced city planner, and she believes that people are empowered by vibrant places, mobility, and connections. Her previous experience includes Deputy Director of Planning and Development for the City of Westerville, Comprehensive Planning Manager for Flagstaff, Arizona, and Architectural Design for Glavin Homes Architects of Richmond, Virginia. Kimberly holds a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from Ohio State University and a Master's in Regional Planning from Virginia Commonwealth University. Thanks for joining us again, Kim. And what we'll do is we'll just have opening statements from the panelists in the order I just introduced them, and then we'll go to some questions for discussion. And as Jerica noted, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them and we'll have a nice discussion here. Okay, Lexi, the floor is yours. Tell us what you know about this.
Thank you so much, Harvey. And I have to say, I feel some major imposter syndrome being here with Kim and Andre. It's an incredible honor to be asked to do this. Sustainable transportation is truly my passion. And I'm so excited that we're having this conversation of how we can bring sustainable transportation and incorporate that into Intel and the growth that our region is going to experience. So what I really want to talk about is just, first of all, the unprecedented growth that Licking County, the surrounding counties, is going to experience. The site itself is going to have 10,000 employees and projected to encourage 30,000 trips a day. That means a lot for our transportation system. It means a lot for the future of congestion, of our air quality, equitable transportation connection. And that is why it is so incredibly important to look at this Intel development as an opportunity to look at sustainable transportation, and not just as something as 30-foot buses that only certain populations use out of need and others use out of choice and go out of their way to use just because of sustainability reasons. We need to look at this as an opportunity. But the thing about an opportunity is that it's something that we can move forward on, or it's something that we can ignore and keep moving towards business as usual. And that's why I'm so very, very happy to be here. So very happy that CURA is having this conversation. Something that I'm extremely proud of that I really want to talk a lot about today, and I'll probably keep going back to throughout our questions, is an application that LCATS, the Licking County Area Transportation Study, submitted for the RAISE grant. And that funding is part of the bipartisan transportation bill. And we applied for just under $5 million in planning funds. And when I say we, it was formally submitted by Licking County, but we helped support the writing of the grant and developing what was in it. And it's a planning grant. So a lot of people are probably like, what the heck is, trying to be accomplished through that? And the answer is a lot of things. We had, I believe, 5 major components to this grant, and I'm going to look at my notes here. The first is data collection and analysis, and that really is a lot of things. It's looking at the data that we already have. MORPC already did a lot of projection data as part of our Insight 2050 partnership. Research and looking at Licking County and our greater region and the growth and the impact on our transportation system. But we need to understand what additional projections we need to understand the capacity that our current system allows and what we need to invest in. We also need to look at our residents, our communities, our other businesses, in addition to Intel. And my hope is that if we look at sustainable and alternative transportation options, we're not just focusing on Intel. We're not just focusing on employees. We're the Silicon Heartland, not the Silicon Valley. And we need to look at the greater community at large, in addition to desirable transportation for workforce. Next is the initial investment proposal. And this is where we'd be asking a potential consultant to look at a variety of transportation modes, programs, services, technology that could create the transportation mobility network that we need to meet this impact. It's going to take a lot of different things. People want options in the transportation system. They want whatever is going to fit their needs, what's going to be efficient, what's going to be perceived as the safest and cheapest mode of transportation. And so we're going to need to look at a lot of different things. And part of this initial investment review will be also looking at the funding necessary, the collaboration necessary to make this happen. Next is a really important piece that I'm also going to be talking a lot about today, I'm sure, and that's stakeholder and public engagement. Obviously, in planning, we need to be thinking about public engagement. We need to have community support. And more importantly, we need to be meeting community needs. And we're only going to find that out as we continue to engage with communities, engage with residents, engage with the workforce population. But, transit, sustainable mobility isn't exactly the most favored form of transportation investment in the state. I don't think that's much of a secret. And so we need to build stakeholder support. We have a lot of champions in the state. Some of them are on this call right now. But we need to encourage that stakeholder support and show the economic benefit, the return on investment that alternative transportation can have on communities, on local governments, on businesses to make this happen. We also need to show people that transit can take different forms. It can take community context in mind. There's so many amazing things when you use alternative transportation based on a specific communities, a specific region's needs. And once we have that support, we want to have the final investment recommendation. And that's going to change that initial investment proposal because we'll have, made tweaks based on the community stakeholders, residents' perspectives in mind. And lastly, the most important thing I think here is that we need an implementation and governance plan. I think something that a lot of our transportation partners in the region and the state should acknowledge is that there's not one organization that's going to champion this. It's going to be a partnership, just like everything else that we've been working for and working towards different programs and investments. This is another thing that's going to be a collaboration. And I do see a lot of hope for what's to come. But again, one, I hope we get this funding. And even if we don't, we are working on an action plan to make it happen. And two, I really hope we maintain this momentum. We don't get discouraged and we use this opportunity to really revolutionize our region in mobility and in equity and sustainability.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lexi. That was a good opening statement. And believe me, anyone who works with you realizes you're not an imposter. So let's move on to Andre. Andre, you're a transportation researcher. Tell us about what you think about the impacts of Intel on our current transportation infrastructure, and how do we make sure this doesn't have negative impacts?
Sure. So obviously, yes, Intel is making a huge investment here in the northeastern Columbus area, and undoubtedly it's going to add new residents to the area, and it's going to add traffic. Now, when we talk about traffic impacts, at least primarily we tend to think about commute traffic, right? So like along Route 161, people going to and from the Intel facilities. But the impacts are actually going to be more distributed than that, because this is potentially adding several thousand new households to the area of people who might move here to be employed by Intel. And so each of these households is going to have their own transportation needs. And this extra population would also generate traffic for shopping, for leisure, etc. Now, I can't tell you for sure whether, where, and when this would create congestion problems. I haven't studied the area directly in that regard, but I can give you some general insights here. I mean, the first one is, if we're thinking about commute traffic, say Route 161, the impacts are really going to depend on whether the demand going to and from the Intel facilities is very, for lack of a better word, peaky. Like if they operate shifts where many people come and go at the same time, it could temporarily overburden the freeway entrances and exits nearby and affect through traffic. But the second thing, again, still just thinking about traffic, and I'll talk about non-traffic topics afterwards, but it's important when we talk about congestion, because I know this has been a concern that has come up in the planning process. When we think about congestion, it's important to realize that the development of congestion on a roadway, this is not a linear process. So if I add a few cars to a road that is already very congested, then the impact on travel times it's a lot more severe than if I add those cars to a road that is not congested at the outset. And so given the background of the general growth of the Columbus metro area, not just because of Intel, but because generally Columbus has been growing over the last decades, there's increased traffic in many parts of the city due to that growth. And so even adding a smaller, modest amount of traffic due to the Intel facilities could potentially have a disproportionate effect. Now, with that said, the direct traffic impact is only one aspect. I mean, there's certainly going to be disruptions during the construction process. Those will be temporary. But in the long run, Intel says that they will be adding 3,000 permanent jobs. Now, overall, that's not a huge number. So to give you an idea of the scale, the JP Morgan Chase campus up at the McCoy Center near Polaris, they employ 13,000 people. So 10,000 more than what Intel says they're going to be adding. So it's likely that in terms of the direct traffic impact, I mean, I think there are bounds on what we could expect here. And we can probably manage this with appropriate adjustments of the roadway network. But I think this would be a huge missed opportunity if we don't consider this opportunity to prevent all of the commute travel going to and from the Intel facilities from happening by car. And that brings me, so this brings me to the second aspect, right? I said direct traffic impacts, commuting traffic, that's one aspect. But the other part of this, and this is actually thinking about this new Intel development, this is the part that personally concerns me a little bit more, is the location itself. Because the facilities are being located at the fringes of the Columbus metro area in what is currently a relatively rural area. And so that could spur a lot of additional development of housing and businesses that would decide to locate there. And the one unfortunate fact is that as transportation infrastructure is being improved to accommodate additional traffic to and from Intel, so like the addition of a lane to 161, that improvement, that could have the side effect of attracting additional growth as businesses and developers choose to locate there, because now all of a sudden travel times by car to that area are more favorable or there's less congestion. So what that does is that creates more traffic through a phenomenon that we know as induced demand. And so why I'm concerned about this is that most likely, given the location, I would expect that if not properly planned and regulated, any new development in that part of Columbus could be sprawled, low density, and very auto-dependent development. So in that sense, what the Intel investment would do, besides the direct impacts, is that it indirectly could lead to a lot more traffic that's not actually really related to Intel. And that could certainly cause problems. And in general, this type of low density suburban development, it typically forces people to drive everywhere. It leads to congestion, leads to pollution, a lot of external externalities. And it's really not what we want from a sustainability and equity perspective. Now, and additionally, it's very hard to serve by transit. Or to add pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure for that matter, in many cases. So given that, given the difficulty of adding alternative transportation infrastructure once these sorts of low density road networks are in place, it kind of cements the status quo into the system. So given this site, I think it's, at this point, we're in the planning stage, so it's still possible to steer the development in a positive direction with appropriate zoning policies, with planning for maybe mandating the addition of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And if there's new development, of designing in such a way that it can support transit, and preferably even some high performance transit, such as perhaps bus rapid transit, like the CODA CMAX, what we currently have is the CODA CMAX system.
Thanks, Andre. I want to come back to induced demand later because I have some questions about that.
Sure.
I'm glad you brought that up. But before we do that, let's hear from Kim. Kim, tell us how CODA's thinking about this and how they're viewing and what they're doing about this potential impact on our transportation infrastructure here in Central Ohio.
Sure. Thanks, Harvey. CODA has been working closely with our partners at the City of New Albany, City of Columbus, MORPC, also talking to Licking County, ODOT, and One Columbus to really understand the role that transit can play in getting people to these jobs, moving the workforce, which we currently do, but it's understanding where and how much. And it's true, the workforce, the job centers are really shifting. And so our ideas about where people are coming from and going to are definitely different than they were even 2 years ago. So taking into that in account, we really need to work on this together to look at the data, look at the maps, talk to the communities. A lot of us live in these communities and really understand how this works together. Yes, the site is in Licking County, but we do anticipate many Franklin County residents will be employed at the site as well. It'll really be a multi-county workforce draw, as say Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker is also a multi-county draw, and that's a good example of how a lot of people are coming in. But in many of our conversations, we've really stressed the need to think about multimodal options as well as land use patterns. I think Andre really pointed it out, but understanding if we keep sprawling and growing in a certain way, it will lead to very difficult ways to serve by transit. It's very difficult to bike and walk your way out of cul-de-sacs. So really it's how we build and how we plan transit with those land use patterns is the only way we're going to be able to solve this together as a community. And I think it's keeping it in context that this whole project is really about a good product that the United States very much needs. It's also about a lot of jobs at varying scales, which of course brings the need for more housing, more schools, more medical facilities. And we can plan on this together as a community, where and how can it all be planned where it makes sense? It's easy. It's easy to choose to walk or bike or take transit, because that is how you work towards a more affordable and sustainable long-term community. When that is an easy choice to make. And it's really tempting sometimes to think the easy answer is to add a lane or add a turn lane, but our past experience has really shown that doesn't solve, it's momentary solution, but it certainly doesn't solve it for the long term. So I'll encourage us to continue on the path with the Link Us Columbus. I don't know if anyone wants to type that into the chat, linkuscolumbus.com. We're on a path of trying to figure out long-term multi-mobility solutions. Now this focuses on, of course, transit, bike and ped together. While we know that working with our partners at ODOT, that you have to layer all the modes together. It has to work as a system. And really that integrated mobility system is how we get to safer and easier ways to get around. So we really want to support each other. We want to support those trying to work on solutions. We want to support the planning efforts in Licking County and Franklin County, because we have an opportunity now to design a transportation system with land use patterns that really change the way people get around. So the Intel site could be designed with transit, pedestrians, and bicyclists in mind. And we can together really rethink. I'm going to give an example, 161 from Dublin all the way to Newark. We can do that together. And if we go back to the Insight 2050 corridors concepts and the idea of denser development around transit locations, we can really rethink this. And now is definitely the time.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Really appreciate that. I agree with your perspectives on this about this multimodal approach and also an integrated approach that involves both transportation and land use. So I want to get back to something that both of you raised. The fact that most of the news we're hearing about these transportation projects related to Intel so far seem to be about road and highway expansion. So we've already brought up the concept of induced demand, which basically says as you add more capacity to roads and highways, all you do is generate more traffic and you don't really solve the problem. At best, you have a temporary solution. There's so much solid evidence for this in transportation science, both theoretical, empirical evidence. It's almost called a law now, the law of traffic congestion. I've seen it discussed in transportation science. Why does this seem to be such a hard sell to people? Not only the people at large, but also like some of our agencies and organizations that are involved in it. They always seem to reach for this highway expansion. How do we change that conversation away from just expanding our roads and highways? And that's also for you as well, Lexi, because I know you're working on kind of urban-rural integration at MORPC. But let me start with Andre. How do we convince people that this is not a good idea?
Well, I mean, first, in general, absolutely, you know what you're saying, and if I can put this in some other words also, building roads begets more traffic, right? It just ends up causing more traffic, more congestion, and more urban sprawl. You can't build your way out of congestion, and we know this quite well at this point. We've unfortunately made that experience many times over throughout the country, where roads have been widened or constructed to accommodate additional traffic. And within a few years, they were back at the starting point because traffic just increased to reach the same levels of congestion they had before. I think the question of how to change I mean, you're right that there's a ton of evidence at this point. You could practically call it a law. Yes, I mean, we've observed this over and over, and at this point, we know that simply adding capacity does not solve a problem. It's how to make our way out of this is a tricky one. I think some of it comes down to standards and codes that are unfortunately they're slow to change and have become embedded in many statewide transportation planning guidelines and many municipal codes. One of the things that I thought about as I was preparing for this webinar was in traffic engineering, for example. I mean, if you think of the distribution of traffic throughout the day, throughout a year, you have a certain distribution, and it never makes sense to design a roadway to accommodate the most congested hour of the year. And practically nobody does that. But the question is then, how much congestion are you willing to tolerate? And what's typically done in the US nowadays is that we usually build our roads to accommodate about the 30th to the 50th highest congested hours. So technically speaking, that says we're willing to accept only about 30 hours of real congestion on our roadways in a year. In my opinion, that is extremely generous. And accepting some more congestion, it would do two things. It would save on infrastructure funds, but it also helps promote urban density, because adding a little bit of adding a little bit of friction to driving actually can have a positive feedback effect. Now, as I said, these are codes that in many cases are decades old, or conventions that are decades old, and that were really designed kind of from a more technocratic perspective without considering, let's say, broader sustainability or equity goals. And it's really time to revisit these at this point.
And Kim, why is a multimodal solution really the way to go here? Can you explain that? We're not talking everyone riding a bus or everyone, we're talking about having a more balanced transportation system, I think.
Yes, I'll address one thing Andre said about peak times. So we're watching traffic patterns, both our ridership on existing transit as well as the streetlight data from ODOT. And it's really, peak times are really different, with so much remote work, those moving to work that need to, healthcare facilities, warehousing, logistics, et cetera. Peak times are very different. And the ridership on existing public transit peak times are very different than, and roadway peak times don't really exist anymore. So the way we design for peak, that is a whole new conversation. And you're right about that, Andre. And I'm excited to kind of find out at the state level what their thinking is on that. And I know those conversations are coming. So I think that's very interesting. Can you repeat what you just said for me specifically?
Oh, certainly. I was just wondering if you could drill down a little more on why a multimodal solution is the benefits are to dealing with the impacts like this.
Sure. So the way I get people to think about it, sometimes I always say, so what's the favorite city you've ever visited and why? You know, you get everything from Savannah, Georgia to New York City to Paris to whatever, but whatever city or location, of course, maybe not if it's a national park unless they have a great shuttle system, but most cities people love are very walkable. They're vibrant, things are going on. There's just beautiful things about it. And there's always mobility choices for the most part. And there's a pretty healthy system of different ways of getting around. Hardly anyone says that their favorite place they visited, they would drive in really fast. It was super easy to park and they could drive out really fast. That is very rarely somebody's favorite place to be. And so really multi-mobility is about this place we're creating. And yes, the jobs are very important. And yes, access to the jobs. But really the places we're creating are the places where people want to stay. They want to work, they want to stay, their kids want to stay, your friends want to visit. And it's really about that easy to get around. There's choices. It's also about the landscaping and how we handle stormwater and that it's dense enough to be walkable in pockets. You know, the whole discussions we've had about 15-minute cities or 15-minute neighborhoods is really, really applicable to this as well. So we're designing places for people to be, but it's also respecting the places we have. I think there's friction currently because there are rural communities that people are very proud of and happy, and they want to cherish the rural communities. And I can understand that. I actually grew up on a farm in Ohio. But there's a vibrant city, and Columbus is really growing, and it's something that we're really proud of and we want to support. But there's friction there because the Intel site is right on that edge of the rural communities and the urban communities. And we need to design a system that's respectful of the various communities. So lots of cars and lots of highways makes that challenging, but having choices of getting around make it easier, but that's still to come.
Right. And Lexi, I'll turn to you now because you worked on the MORPC Regional Mobility Plan, and that does involve incorporating both urban mobility and rural mobility and linking the two. And certainly people can listen to this conversation and say, well, that's okay for you city folk, but we live in you know, out in the country or in rural areas where we don't have public transit. So tell us the challenge and give us some idea about your approach here.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know what the regional mobility plan is, first of all, it's not a mobility plan in the sense of like we're looking at throwing in autonomous shuttles and bike share in rural communities. This plan is something that's federally required for funding that supports the mobility of older adults, people with disabilities, and people with lower incomes. So we're looking mainly at transit systems in our region that, you know, are open to the public, or they're specifically for older adults and people with disabilities, because in some of our counties, those county transit agencies only serve specific populations because of how they can contract and get reimbursed, and that's the only capacity that they have, and that's, you know, it's understandable. But this plan that we did, it was the first time that Central Ohio or MORPC had, you know, attempted to serve 9 counties in this capacity of developing this plan for and with, you know, human service agencies or transit agencies, the general public, workforce, you know, college students, older adults, senior centers. It was the first time we tried to do this for 9 counties. Previously, we've done it for Delaware and Franklin counties, but this was a really big feat. We also did it without guidance from ODOT because it was still in a pilot mode. One of the things that we had to do was get resolutions of approval from all of the county commissioners that were not covered by MORPC's MPO area or Licking County LCAT's planning organization area. So we had, you know, in most cases, getting these resolutions approved was not difficult. We had wonderful support from the commissioners, but there was one case where it was very, very difficult. Even though this resolution was only intended to support, you know, disadvantaged populations, older adults and people with disabilities and people with lower income. So it's when you, like Andre, you mentioned the equity piece, that's not really a good argument anymore. And as much as it should be, as much as the people in this room really want it to be, it's not, because of two reasons. You know, some of these individuals, and it's okay because it's an education gap. I truly think, you know, education is a big piece of this, you know, and it's something for us to be aware of as we move forward. But, you know, economic benefit, return on investment is important to the, you know, to certain stakeholders. And again, what Kim mentioned, maintaining that rural context, that rural feel of communities. They are very, very scared of what they think transit, it does just come in one form, and it's going to disrupt the communities that they have. Now they're concerned about other things as well in some cases, but that is something to think about. Now, we did get all the resolutions at the end of the day, but there was other things that happened that we still have to overcome moving forward. So it's a challenge. But what I want to take away from that is we know how to frame the message. We know what information to share. We're not changing the message. We're not fibbing. We're just, you know, highlighting the information that matters most. We, you know, I think a big part of being a planner, being a community leader in this area is that you need to listen first and listen to concerns, and then share the benefits, because obviously the equity piece is close to our hearts. But we need to show what the return on investment and mobility is. And it's, you know, Harvey, you asked earlier too, you know, what can we do to change the message to make this happen with key stakeholders? And, you know, we're not going to have the density that New York City has, that a lot of these major cities have, especially in the Licking County, New Albany area. It's going to have to change. We're going to have to be innovative. That's why it's so important that we think about various modes in tandem, various services that meet the needs of different populations and different communities. So it's going to be quite a dynamic approach that takes strategized communication and education.
Great. I want to pick up on a couple things that were said. One is this idea of equity, but also workforce development, and they're very closely tied. They're just basically different lenses of looking at the same problem, which is accessibility. So, you know, a lot of these people being hired by Intel are going to be highly paid engineers with a lot of locational freedom. But what do we do to ensure that people, you know, maybe in the lower economic spectrum are not going to be highly paid engineers have access to these economic opportunities? And I also, as part of that, I also am wondering, are we considering like other types of solutions, like on-demand public transit, employer-sponsored van pools, ride hailing? What is the right mix to achieve both workforce development for Intel, but also, you know, better social equity for people in Central Ohio? Kim, go ahead.
All of those options are on the table. And, you know, it takes many, and I hate to use the word products but there's many different ways to, you know, address mobility options. And transit is not just a bus, right? It's on demand. It is the vehicles. It's also light rail. It's also streetcars. It's all of that is transit. And you have to really develop a system that works for your community. What was the first part of the question?
Just asking about how do we address this question of both workforce development and equitable access to these opportunities?
So thank you. I knew I was going to. So I'm at a conference right now in Indianapolis, and it's put on by the Urban Land Institute of Indianapolis, and it's all about equitable development. And the focus is equitable development. I did a tour yesterday focusing on the Red Line, their Indigo high capacity rapid transit line, and the development happening around it and on it, and how it's coordinated. But the focus is equitable development. Because of course, development is going to happen. It is. But how do you ensure equity? And I'll share my most inspiring speaker yesterday is a construction manager. She's a construction manager working on hundreds of billion-dollar projects all over. And she would work with the local community before the construction started and really go in and say, we're going to have thousands of construction jobs here. And then after that, these are the type of jobs coming. And then she would work with that local community's Department of Small Business Certification and Workforce Development, and really do like on the job, on the site, hiring ahead of time, pulling in locals, allowing the locals to understand these are the jobs coming short term, these are the jobs coming long term. How can you prepare yourself for these jobs and be a part of the success? And I'm not going to go into the details, but it was quite inspiring.
Andre, what do you know? I mean, how well do all these different aspects of transit work together in your experience? And how do we ensure that we have like this integrated multimodal system? Can you comment on that?
Sure. And actually, you know, I actually want to pick up on one thing also that you brought up, which was on-demand transit specifically here, because I mean, I think that's one other aspect of the location in Albany. It's not exactly a cheap place to live, and if we want to ensure access and the opportunity for people to work for Intel who are not highly trained engineers, but are perhaps in the lower end of the income scale, then we need to think about how they would access that site, and not only by car. Not everybody has access to or reliable access to a car. And so I think transit really plays a key role here, especially if we're talking about distances that are a little beyond walkable and bikeable. Now, obviously, you know, in general, in lower density areas, it can be difficult to sustain, to make regular fixed route transit financially viable. And you mentioned on-demand transit and microtransit, and I think to me this is something really exciting, a technology that's developed over the last decade or so, which can be provided by a public agency. We have CODA Plus, which I think has been very successful in various parts of Columbus, but can also be an employer-sponsored service where the employer actually provides this on-demand service to their employees. And these both of these things can play an important role in supporting job access by lower income individuals who might also have to live farther away from the site. And actually, I mean, specifically with the as far as the employer-sponsored shuttles go, I think we've had somewhat limited experiences in the Columbus area with those so far. We actually not too long ago, we did a study here at the OSU Wexner Medical Center where we investigated the potential of employer-sponsored microtransit, so on-demand minivans, about 12 to 15 people, that you can order by app and they come and pick you up and take you to work. And we were actually surprised by the overwhelmingly positive response that we got in the survey, and the fact that it actually looked like it would be a very promising alternative to car commuting, and even here in a very car-centric area. So I think this definitely should be considered. Now, the issue is, of course, I mean, employer-sponsored, even an employer-sponsored shuttle, the employer has to agree to kick in some sort of funding for this. And in doing so, it's good to keep in mind that the benefits that accrue from a system like this, I mean, it's really not just about like direct savings from car expenditures, but there are a lot more benefits going beyond that by providing job access for people who otherwise would not have access, by the environmental benefits. Now, one thing that I should mention, and this is of course potentially tricky, but you know, I mentioned the OSU study. Now, of course, if you're trying to get people to shift from car commuting to using, say, a employer-sponsored microtransit service, any sort of shift in behavior, I mean, you can achieve that with carrots by providing a high-quality system, and with some sticks, right? And maybe a combination of both. And in the OSU case, we kind of have that some sorts of sticks there, in the sense of very congested parking facilities, people having to park at satellite lots with park and ride services, so they can't just park in front of the door, and parking fees, right? So you work at OSU, you have to get a parking pass and you have to pay for that. And that's not really common otherwise. But adding those sorts of direct expenditures or additions to like things that make the car commute a little more unpleasant can also be a huge motivation for people to look at alternatives.
Right. We brought up some of the other benefits and costs of transportation surrounding this development. Intel is claiming that they're going to be carbon neutral eventually with this plant. Shouldn't transportation be part of that? That's sort of a rhetorical question, but that certainly seems to be one of the areas where Intel could make progress on carbon, or should be considering what they're going to claim to be carbon neutral. There's other benefits as well. We can see, we're making progress here in Central Ohio on air quality, which is good. We don't want to go backwards now. And also, there's a big Vision Zero program in Columbus now to try to reduce the number of traffic fatalities. So, Lexi, when you talk to these very diverse stakeholders, both in big cities, small towns, rural areas, do some of these other aspects come up, or do you bring them up, and does it resonate with these stakeholders?
Well, you're asking about Vision Zero and becoming climate neutral specifically?
And air quality. There's all the
Air
other
quality.
benefits besides just cost and travel time, but all the other reasons why we shouldn't discontinue, building roads and doubling down on more cars.
Yes. Honestly, no, because in these communities, transportation is a need. It's a need right now in our region. And that's going to be emphasized, with this, coming growth. It should be. And, we have, again, I say opportunity a lot, but we have an opportunity to engage with Intel before the site is here, before the employers are here, to communicate this. And, going back to what Andre was saying about employers subsidizing transportation for their employees, that's going to be key. And we want to do this in other counties. We want to do it with, many well-known major employers in our region. And they love the conversations. They love talking about it. But the second they hear that they have to pay into it, they start backing away, and they're like, oh, maybe you should talk to this person instead. But we're still hearing about the need from the community, from employees. So I think, that's why it is so very important that we have these conversations, that we talk about Vision Zero, that we talk about being carbon neutral, that, we talk about, the benefits of an employer subsidized transportation system now, as soon as possible. And also there's something Andre also mentioned that I found particularly insightful, but now I forget. But absolutely, we need to be having these conversations now. And if we don't, we'll really be wishing that we did.
Right.
So Harvey, this is Kim, and speaking directly to Intel, we are in a way, if you look at the participant list, which I have, a lot of folks on this call today have been tasked with helping to figure out the solutions. And so with that, the exciting part is I know the right conversations are going on. Mm-hmm. And I know people are very interested in how to move the workforce, even the younger workforce who's in training. The schools are very interested to be a part of the pipeline. The schools are very interested in how to plan and integrate with transit and bicycle and walking options for their students in the future workforce. The interest is there. I think it's a matter of the planning principles really working closely together. I'll point out the Link Us partners of CODA, MORPC, the City of Columbus and Franklin County, along with those we're working with at ODOT, the Columbus Partnership and the surrounding counties. I know that together we can lay out all of these options and present some of the best solutions. And yes, it will take investments, and yes, it will take operations, but we have to look at it with the return on those investments, and we have to look at it with all the other benefits to our community, not just the initial capital investment. And we have to truly understand the change in commuting patterns, and we can actually lay out that path. And now is the time.
Great. Yeah, I want to. Oh, go ahead, Andre.
Sorry. I just wanted to add to this quickly. I mean, since we're talking about employer-provided transportation, I mean, obviously So the model, the model that comes to mind here are the tech shuttles in the Bay Area, which, I mean, for better or for worse, I know there are both positive and negative impacts that have been discussed of those. But I mean, that's the model of a transportation system provided by, in this case, primarily tech companies to their employees, and it's very much considered by the employees a perk provided by the company, right? It's not. I mean, I suspect in most cases these are not altruistic reasons for which the company is operating these shuttles, but rather they're doing it as a service to their employees, and it's very valued by their employees.
And in fact, we have a model for that here. We have the very successful CODA CPAS program, right? That
Yep,
really
exactly.
got people
Right.
on public transit. And
Yep.
is there other conversations? Maybe you can't, Kim, with Intel about something like that?
There will be, and I know the Short North just recently passed an employee pass program that's really successful and makes it super easy for folks that work in the Short North to download their pass. It's being provided by the Short North Parking Alliance to just, jump on and off those 6 different lines running up and down High Street or wherever they need to go. So yes, I think there's some really great examples that we can continue.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jerica now. There's a few questions from the audience. I'd like to give her a chance to field those and have you answer them. Please, Jerica.
So we have a couple of questions, particularly on other solutions. So besides pedestrian, like pathways, cycles, and buses, are there any discussions of rail, or has anybody heard of anything for any type of rail discussions?
So Lexi, yes, the answer is yes. And there's ongoing and conversations from the MORPC staff with the state level about the potential of Amtrak. So that will continue. And I know that in the long-term planning efforts and in the RAISE grant submitted by LCATS and MORPC, there's a serious consideration of the rail connection between downtown Newark and downtown Columbus, specifically because it's the only right of way currently owned by the state of Ohio. All of the others are privately owned. And then, of course, in the Link Us modeling efforts, we continue to look at all modes, and we have to follow a very strict federal process of assessing. When I say mode, it means what, bus rapid transit, light rail, streetcar, on demand, what makes the most sense for the investment. And so that really helps outline what makes the most sense because of projected ridership, cost, development potential. So all of that will continue. But yes, it has to be part of the consideration.
And I just want to expand on what Kim just mentioned, all of that and more. I mean, when we wrote the RAISE grant with LCATS, and we purposely said in the narrative that we want, all the options analyzed and researched with the community context in mind, with the demand in mind, with the needs and desires of all the populations that we intend to serve. But also we want this investment to be warranted. We want the technology that's reviewed and suggested warranted. And people might be thinking, are you looking at air taxis or autonomous vehicles? And the answer is, sure, if it's warranted, truthfully, we want whatever is, sought out in this investment of mobility assets to actually be meaningful for the geography and the populations. So there could be many things explored in our pursuit of this new and collaborative mobility investment. But it's very, very, very important that it is warranted through research and data and all of the good things that planners and engineers look at for these types of projects.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have another question asking about kind of what would happen to 161 with the people who are commuting from that area. So has that been considered throughout these conversations?
Can I talk about that too, Lexi? But she's going to add. The answer is yes. And it's multiple partners. And I'm speaking, on behalf of CODA, that's only one part of the system. really thinking about 161 from Dublin and beyond, to the west and to Newark. Think about the different neighborhoods you're going through and what type of connection that is. Thinking about that as a multimodal corridor with the 15-minute neighborhoods, really developing in a very respectful way in the right context for that area, whether it's more of a rural community or definitely in the city, and what the possibilities are is just huge. And we're already, the region is already behind tens of thousands of housing units already. And that was before the Intel announcement was made. We have to think about this in context of the development along with the moving patterns. So Lexi, I think you want to add to the 161 conversation.
And with everything that Kim just said in mind, with all the conversation that we just had today, I feel like I have to bring up the MTP amendment that was just announced in a press release earlier this month that noted 161 construction and widening and also considering projects on New Albany local roads. And there's more to this amendment than widening roads. And it's also important to realize it's one piece of the network. The same organization that made this amendment in our guiding document that guides all of our transportation work for the region is also pursuing alternative transportation resources. So yes, I mean, that is just, if any of you are curious on that press release and the amendments. I should also clarify that MTP is our Metropolitan Transportation Plan that guides our Metropolitan Planning Organization for anyone who's not familiar, but it's on morpc.org. And I'm sure you'll have our contact information if you have any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It looks like we have one more asking about it says, explain the recongestion of the road following build out. So what does that mean? Recongestion.
I can perhaps speak to that. So I think this is about induced demand.
Yeah.
And the overall sort of from a roadway operations perspective, I mean, we have certain standards where we say, we want traffic to be able to flow at a certain rate on our roadways. We want to be able to provide a certain level of service, certain speeds on roadways. And so agencies will typically follow, if those are not being achieved, and if there's too much congestion and traffic is slowed down too much, gets snarled at rush hour, the solution has typically been that, okay, we clearly have too much demand here, we need to increase capacity. And when we increase roadway capacity, particularly, these are very costly investments. They require a lot of additional land for additional lanes. And typically the return that you get for that investment in terms of additional capacity is, I mean, it's still somewhat limited just by the inefficiency of car as a transportation mode and the amount of space it takes. But what typically happens then is that as you have increased capacity now and you bring down speed, or you bring up speeds, bring down the density on the roadway, it actually entices people to travel more, to travel farther, because now they can more easily get to locations that took too long to get to beforehand. Businesses will plan to locate their developers build at locations that might be very suburban or exurban, and basically just banking on the fact that, well, people can easily get into the city. And so within a few years, then you basically see that extra roadway capacity being eaten up by the new demand that was previously not there. I hope I'm answering that question. I think, I mean, it's a little different. We have to distinguish this from, I mean, if we think of like quote unquote normal growth, the question is still where that growth is located, right? And if I have a certain amount of growth that's going to occur in my metro area, if that growth is going to happen in fairly well-served, dense areas that have good pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, have good transit options, that is going to cause a lot less additional traffic than if that growth occurs on the periphery in low-density suburbs, where people then have to drive long distances to get to the places that they want to go. And so where that growth occurs, the amount of traffic that gets generated is very different depending on location of the growth. And so what we're saying is adding roadway capacity often encourages growth at I'll say in the wrong places, so to speak.
Good, you did answer that question well, I think.
Thank
And
you.
with that, we are actually out of time. So I want to thank our panelists, Lexi Petrella, Andre Carell, and Kim Sharp. Thank you for joining this conversation and helping us continue this community conversation around the impacts of Intel. I want to remind the audience that next week, August 5th, we'll finish this series with the discussion about the impacts of Intel on energy and water in Ohio. And also, we'll be doing a fall seminar series on tech in the city here at CURA, where we're going to talk about how to use all the new data and urban technologies in order to improve engagement in the planning process by people in the community. So check back at our website, cura.osu.edu, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, sign up for our newsletter, and you'll hear all about these exciting events coming up. Again, thank you, panelists, for this very important conversation, and go forth and do great things as you need to. And everyone, see you soon and take care.